Historian Lee Edwards is a distinguished fellow in conservative thought at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us now to talk about these opposing views on the role of government in a capitalist society. Lee, great to have you here. A Pew Research poll late last year found that only 20% of Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing just about always or most of the time. But majorities, more so for Democrats than Republicans, want the government to play a major role in solving problems, such as alleviating poverty. So do you believe Americans are ready now for some bold or sweeping government action?
Well, I think what we have is a divided government, which is reflective of our divided country. The issue, I think you're absolutely right, in my mind, is how much government do we want? How much government do we need? And by the way, this is an argument which has been going on since the founding. So we've been going at this for 240 years, Martin, and here we are. And I think one of the reasons why it has become an issue now, and I agree with you, it has, is because of not only the pandemic, but the fact that the impact that it's had on the government. And this compounds a lot of the faith that Americans have lost in their government because of the Great Recession. So I think we are engaged in a great debate over this issue.
So let's listen to part of Ronald Reagan's 1981 inaugural address. He mentions the word government 17 times in the speech, usually in a negative sense. I'd like your take, Lee, on whether his words 40 years ago still match our current mood.
We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed.
Before you respond, context is, of course, critical. Coming out of the late 1970s, Reagan had a receptive audience for trying something new. But do you agree now that distrust of government seems to be an impediment to solving our problems?
Well, his philosophy was based upon the idea of liberty and the fact that there's no such thing as a free lunch, to quote Milton Friedman, that if you're going to have more government, you're going to have more taxes, you're going to have less money in the pockets of the people. And Reagan was dead flat against that, both as governor of California and as president. And he was the first president to come along since FDR, whom you mentioned, to challenge directly this idea that when we have a problem, let's turn to government. It was, in fact, FDR who in 1932 and 1933, both in a campaign speech and then in an inaugural, in which he said that government has a responsibility to care for the welfare of its citizens.
Right on cue, Lee.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself.
No president ever used that language before of saying that government has a responsibility to care for the welfare of its citizens. And that became more or less accepted and acceptable for the next several decades. And along came Mr. Reagan, who said that in this crisis, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that he said, in this crisis. And what he meant by that was that we need government, particularly in times of crisis, but it has to be controlled.
I think this is what you're referring to.
Now, so there will be no misunderstanding. It's not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work. Work with us, not over us. To stand by our side, not ride on our back.
It was a wonderful phrase which he and other conservatives have used, and that is ordered liberty. That idea of ordered liberty is at the root of Ronald Reagan's philosophy, and I think it's going to be at the root of what conservatives are going to be debating with liberals and progressives led by Mr. Biden, President Biden, in the years ahead.
Well, good segue there. Let's talk about President Biden and what he has in mind. On January 14th, a week before taking the oath of office, he called for what I consider a new Deal of sorts. Those are my words, not his. where the government, after tackling the virus, will still have a role to play in taking care of long-running problems. I want to play you a clip from his speech. It runs about a minute, and then get your thoughts on it.
We'll use taxpayers' dollars to rebuild America. We'll buy American products, supporting millions of American manufacturing jobs, enhancing our competitive strength in an increasingly competitive world. Imagine historic investments in research and development to sharpen America's innovative edge in markets where global leadership is up for grabs. Markets like the battery technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean energy. Imagine confronting the climate crisis with American jobs and ingenuity leading the world. It's time to stop talking about infrastructure and to finally start building an infrastructure.
Well, of course, it is a shopping list, and if you asked any progressive what needs to be done, they would come up, I think, with a very similar laundry list. So I think that what Mr. Biden was doing there was reflecting the philosophy, the ideology, if you will, of the Democratic Party. But there are so many. We have to keep in mind that some 73 million, I think it was, 73 million people voted for Donald Trump. And if they voted for him, they had some idea of his conservative/populist philosophy, which is, that government is best, which governs least, taken right out of Jefferson. And so here we are again. That may be his laundry list, but he is going to have, I think, a real challenge getting all of that through a Congress in which the margins are so narrow for democratic philosophy, for the progressive philosophy.
One area where I can't understand why there isn't a bipartisan stampede to get something done is infrastructure. That would seem to be a place where the federal government has the primary role to get things done.
Well, yes, and I think the precedent there was set by Dwight David Eisenhower with the interstate highway system. People got tired of spending days on getting their kicks on Route 66. They said there must be an easier way to get from the Midwest to the Far West. And so Mr. Eisenhower, basically a conservative, said, well, let's set up the interstate highway system, which he did. So I think in answer to your question of why there hasn't been more action taken on that, is that people got, I won't say distracted, but got pulled into a different direction because of the pandemic.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with the Heritage Foundation historian Lee Edwards. Lee, there's always the chance that if the economy recovers really quickly, it would pull the rug out from under efforts to legislate, let's say, more intrusively into the economy. In his 1937 number 2 inaugural address, Roosevelt said, even in normal times, he saw 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. And he warned Americans not to let what was then a significant, if incomplete, recovery from the Depression fool them into believing they had no more work to do. Let's listen to that.
To hold to progress today is more difficult. Dull conscience, irresponsibility, ruthless self-interest already reappear. Such symptoms of prosperity may become the portents of disaster.
Allow me to repeat what Roosevelt said there because it was a little grainy. Such symptoms of prosperity may become portents of disaster. And he went on to say prosperity already tests the persistence of our progressive purpose. In other words, Roosevelt was worried that the crisis might go to waste.
What would happen if he was able to bring his dreams into reality? I think they'd be a disaster. And in contra to his argument, I would suggest you can look at what Ronald Reagan did with his tax cut recovery program, that he sparked an unprecedented period of economic prosperity lasting well into the next decade because of that. And at the heart of that was both tax cuts and deregulation to allow this great mighty machine that we have a free enterprise in this country to operate. And here we get, I think, an important point I'd like to stress, and that is what we have here with that, I grant, eloquent statement by Mr. Roosevelt is the fatal conceit of the liberal/progressive that the government, that a bureaucracy knows better how to run our lives than we do ourselves.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.